He thought the cameras would protect his son, but that night, they showed him something he was never meant to see. The footage flickered in the dim glow of the control room, a quiet hum of monitors filling the silence as Dominic Russo leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes locked onto a single screen. It was 2:17 a.m. The timestamp blinked in cold white digits, steady, indifferent. Every corner of the mansion was under his watch. Every hallway, every door, every shadow. Control was the only language Dominic trusted anymore. Control kept things from falling apart. Control kept his son safe. On the screen, the camera inside Ethan's bedroom showed soft lamplight spilling across the walls, the boy's motionless form resting in his specialized bed, machines silent but present like quiet witnesses. Ethan Russo hadn't moved on his own in over a year. Not since the accident that had stolen his body but left his eyes, those sharp, observant eyes, trapped behind stillness. Dominic exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that never quite reached peace. Then something shifted. A figure entered the frame. Ava Johnson, the new maid. She moved quietly, almost too quietly, her steps careful against the hardwood floor, as if she respected the room more than anyone else in the house ever had. She wasn't supposed to be there. Dominic's jaw tightened. He didn't like deviations. Not in business. Not in his home. And especially not around his son. Ava approached the bed, her posture gentle, deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate either. The camera angle caught the side of her face. Calm, focused, but there was something else there, something heavier. Something the lens couldn't fully explain. Dominic leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" he muttered under his breath, though no one was there to answer. Ava reached out, her hand hovering just above Ethan's chest before finally resting there, light as air. She didn't speak at first. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Then her lips moved. No sound came through the footage, just the faintest motion, a whisper the cameras couldn't capture. But it was what happened next that made Dominic freeze. Ava's shoulders trembled. Subtly, almost imperceptibly. She bowed her head, her forehead lowering until it nearly touched the edge of the bed, her hands still pressed gently against the boy's chest. And then she closed her eyes. Dominic's. Fingers tightened. This wasn't routine care. This wasn't cleaning or checking vitals or following orders. This was something else. Something personal. Something hidden. He reached for the keyboard, rewinding the footage. Once. Twice. Slower this time. Frame by frame. Ava entering. Ava pausing. Ava touching Ethan like she already knew him. Like she understood something no one else did. Dominic felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had installed those cameras to catch threats, to eliminate risks before they ever reached his son. But as the screen replayed the same quiet moment again, Dominic realized something far more unsettling. The threat wasn't what he expected, and whatever secret Ava Johnson was carrying into that room every night, it was already changing everything. Dominic Russo did not sleep that night because control, once broken, does not return easily, and the image of Ava Johnson standing beside his son refused to leave his mind as if the screen had burned it into him. So instead of resting, he watched, again and again, rewinding the same quiet moment until the seconds began to blur into something heavier than footage and more like a question he could not answer. And by 4:03 a.m., he had already memorized every detail, the exact angle of her hand, the way her shoulders trembled, the pause before she touched Ethan as if she were asking permission from someone who could not speak. And that was what unsettled him the most, because Ava had not looked afraid. She had looked certain, and certainty inside his house without his approval was something Dominic did not tolerate. Not in business, not in loyalty, and definitely not when it came to his son. So when the first light of morning stretched across the marble floors of the mansion, Dominic was already dressed, already waiting, already watching the live feed as the staff began their routine like nothing had changed, even though everything had. The kitchen lights flickered on, footsteps echoed in distant hallways, and Ava appeared again on the screen, moving through the corridor with the same quiet presence. Her uniform simple, her posture straight, her face unreadable. And if someone else had been watching, they would have seen nothing unusual at all. Just another maid starting another day. But Dominic saw patterns where others saw silence, and he noticed how she paused for a fraction of a second outside Ethan's room before continuing past it like she knew exactly where she was not supposed to be seen. And that single hesitation tightened something inside his chest. Not anger yet, but something colder, something sharper, suspicion. He stood slowly and left the control room. His footsteps measured against the polished floor as he moved through his own house like a man who no longer trusted it. And when he entered the main hallway, the air felt different, quieter, as if the walls themselves were. Holding their breath, Ava was already in the living room by then, adjusting a vase of fresh flowers that had been delivered early, her movements precise, controlled, and when she sensed him, she turned immediately, not startled, not nervous, just aware. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, her voice calm in a way that did not match what he had seen hours before. Dominic studied her without responding right away, his eyes searching for something that would confirm what the cameras had suggested. But her expression revealed nothing, not guilt, not fear, just stillness, and that unsettled him more than defiance ever could. "You were in my son's room last night," he said finally, his voice low and even, the kind of tone that did not need to rise to carry authority. Ava did not flinch. She did not step back. She simply held his gaze for a moment before lowering her eyes slightly. Respectful, but not submissive. "Yes, sir," she answered. No excuses, no explanations, just truth, and that answer landed heavier than any lie could have. Dominic felt the shift immediately, something in the room tightening. "You were given clear instructions," he continued, his voice still controlled. "No one enters that room without permission." Ava nodded once, slowly. "I understand," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested she had understood from the beginning, which meant she had chosen to break the rule anyway. And that choice was what Dominic could not ignore. He stepped closer now, close enough to see the faint redness in her eyes, as if sleep had not come easily to her either. "Then explain it to me," he said, his gaze unwavering. "What exactly were you doing to my son?" The words hung between them, sharp but quiet, and for the first time there was a pause, not from fear, but from something deeper. Ava inhaled slowly, her hands still at her sides, her posture steady, and when she finally looked up at him again, there was no apology in her eyes, only something that made Dominic hesitate for the first time since he had installed those cameras, something he had not expected to find inside his own house. Not defiance, not guilt, but conviction. Ava did not speak immediately, and that silence stretched across the room like something alive, something that neither of them could control. Dominic Russo stood there waiting, expecting hesitation, expecting fear, expecting the kind of apology that always followed when someone realized they had crossed a line in his world. But Ava Johnson did not offer him any of those things. Instead, she lifted her chin just slightly and met his eyes again, steady, unshaken, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I was not doing anything to him," she said, and the choice of words made something tighten in Dominic's chest because it was not denial. It was correction. "Then what were you doing?" he asked again, his tone sharper now. Not louder, but edged with something that demanded control. Ava took a small breath as if deciding how much truth to give him, and for a moment her gaze shifted, not away from him, but past him, as if she were seeing something else entirely. Something not in this room. "I was listening," she said, and the answer was so unexpected that Dominic froze, just for a second, his mind rejecting it before he could process it. "Listening," he repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. "He cannot speak." Ava nodded slowly. "Not with words," she said, and there was something in her tone that was not challenging him, but inviting him to understand something he had never considered. Dominic's jaw tightened. "You think you understand my son better than his doctors," he said, and there it was, the edge of disbelief, the quiet resistance of a man who had already spent more money, more time, more hope than anyone else ever would. Ava did not react to the accusation. She did not defend herself. She simply stood there and let the weight of his words pass through the room. "No," she said gently. "I think I understand what it feels like to be trapped." And that was the first moment. Something shifted, not in the room, but inside Dominic himself, because those words did not sound like an excuse. They sounded like a memory. He studied her more carefully now, noticing details he had ignored before, the faint tension in her hands, the way her shoulders carried something heavier than a job. "You were not hired to interpret feelings," he said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. Ava gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth of that. "I know," she replied, and then, after a pause, "But he responds." Dominic's eyes narrowed. "Responds how?" he asked. And now there was something else in his voice, something quieter, something closer to curiosity than suspicion. Ava hesitated for the first time, not because she was afraid, but because what she was about to say mattered. "Last night," she said slowly, "his breathing changed when I touched him." Dominic's expression hardened immediately. "That could mean anything," he said, dismissing it before it could take shape. Ava did not argue. She simply held her ground. It could, she agreed, but it did not feel like nothing. And there was again that quiet certainty that did not ask for permission. Dominic felt the tension return, the need to reassert control rising instinctively. "You will not go into that room again without my permission," he said firmly, and this time there was no room for interpretation. Ava lowered her gaze briefly, acknowledging the command. "Yes, sir," she said, but something in the way she said it told him that obedience was not the same as agreement. Dominic turned away then, ending the conversation before it could shift any further. But as he walked down the hallway, the words lingered, not with words. The phrase echoed in his mind in a way he could not silence. And for the first time since the accident, Dominic Russo found himself questioning something he had believed without doubt. Not the doctors, not the diagnosis, but the possibility that somewhere inside the stillness of his son, there was something waiting, something he had been too busy watching to ever truly see. Dominic Russo did not return to the control room right away, which in itself was unusual because routine had always been his shield, his structure, the one thing that kept uncertainty from creeping into places it did not belong. But now, as he stood outside Ethan's bedroom door, his hand resting lightly against the polished wood, he hesitated, not out of fear, but because something inside him had shifted just enough to make certainty feel incomplete. The hallway was quiet, the early afternoon light stretching across the floor in long, soft lines. And for a moment Dominic simply listened, not to the house, not to footsteps or distant voices, but to the silence behind the door. A silence he had grown used to, a silence he had accepted as permanent. And yet, now it felt different, not louder, not broken, but somehow less empty. He opened the door slowly, stepping inside with the same controlled presence he carried everywhere. The room was exactly as it always was, clean, ordered, untouched by chaos. Ethan lay in bed, still, his eyes open, focused somewhere beyond the ceiling as if the world existed just out of reach. Dominic approached, his gaze softening in a way no one else ever saw. "Hey, kid," he said quietly, his voice losing its edge the moment it was meant only for his son. There was no response, not in the way most people would expect. No words, no movement, just the same steady stillness that had defined the past year. But Dominic stayed there longer than usual, watching, not with the detached calculation he used in the control room, but with something closer, something personal. His mind replayed Ava's words whether he wanted it to or not with words. He exhaled slowly, dismissing the thought as he had dismissed so many others before. Doctors had explained everything. Specialists had confirmed it. Progress was unlikely, minimal at best. Hope had been carefully measured and reduced into something manageable, something safe, and Dominic had accepted that because acceptance was easier than uncertainty. But now uncertainty had returned, and it was quieter than doubt, more persistent. He reached out, adjusting the blanket slightly over Ethan's chest. A small, routine gesture, one he had done countless times, but as his hand hovered there for just a moment longer than usual, he noticed something, not a movement, not exactly, but a change, subtle, almost imperceptible. Ethan's breathing shifted just slightly. Dominic froze, his eyes narrowing as he focused, waiting, measuring. The rhythm of his son's chest rising and falling had always been steady, predictable, but now there was a variation, small, inconsistent, and yet different enough to be noticed, Dominic leaned closer, his attention sharpening. "Ethan," he said quietly, not expecting an answer, but needing to anchor the moment to something real. The room remained still, the machine silent, the air unchanged, and yet the feeling lingered. Something had happened, or maybe it had not. Maybe it was nothing more than coincidence, the kind that plays tricks on people who are looking for something that is not there. Dominic straightened slowly, stepping back as his mind began to reassert control, patterns, explanations, logic. He had built his life on understanding cause and effect, on eliminating variables, on ensuring that nothing happened without reason, and yet this moment did not fit into any of those structures. He turned toward the door, pausing briefly as his eyes moved to the corner of the room where the camera was mounted, small, discreet, always watching, always recording. For the first time, Dominic did not feel reassured by its presence. Instead, he felt something else, something unfamiliar, the sense that watching had not given him answers, only distance. He left the room without another word, his steps slower now, more deliberate, and as he walked back down the hallway, one thought remained, quiet but persistent. If what Ava said was true, then everything he had trusted might not be enough. And if it was not true, then why did it feel like something inside that room had just changed without permission, without explanation, without control? Dominic Russo returned to the control room that evening not out of habit, but out of necessity, because the uncertainty that had followed him all day had not faded. It had sharpened, and now it demanded answers. The monitors lit up the darkened space with a cold, steady glow, each screen displaying a different corner of the mansion, each angle offering clarity without understanding. He stood there for a moment before sitting, his hand resting on the console as if he were about to take control of something that had already slipped beyond it. Then he pulled up the footage from earlier, not just the moment with Ava, but everything, every second from the past 12 hours. He watched Ethan's room first, focusing on the rhythm of his son's breathing, rewinding, replaying, slowing it down frame by frame until the subtle shift he had noticed earlier appeared again. There was slight but undeniable a change in timing, a variation that did not belong to the pattern he had memorized over months of observation. Dominic leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he compared it to earlier recordings from previous days, pulling up files from a week ago, then 2 weeks, then a month, each one showing the same steady, unchanging rhythm. Until today, he exhaled slowly, the realization settling in without permission. Something was different, and the only variable that had changed was Ava. He switched to another angle, the hallway camera outside Ethan's room. And there she was again from earlier that morning, passing by, pausing for just a fraction of a second. Then continuing on, Dominic froze the frame, studying her posture, her expression, searching for something hidden in plain sight, but the screen offered no answers, only the same quiet composure that had unsettled him from the beginning. He leaned back slightly, his mind working through possibilities, coincidence, misinterpretation, emotional projection. He had seen men build entire empires on assumptions and lose them the same way. He was not one of those men. He dealt in certainty, in proof, in things that could not be questioned. And yet this moment refused to fit into any category he trusted. He moved to the footage from the previous night, the one he had watched repeatedly. Ava entering the room, her hand hovering, then resting on Ethan's chest. Dominic slowed it down again, focusing not on her this time, but on Ethan, his chest rising and falling, his face still, his eyes unmoving. And then there was again, subtle but present, a change in breathing, a slight shift in rhythm at the exact moment her hand made contact. Dominic paused the frame, his finger hovering over the keyboard, his mind rejecting the implication even as it formed. He pressed play again, watching it unfold in real time. No distortion, no illusion. Just the same sequence repeating with quiet consistency. Ava's presence, Ethan's response. Dominic sat back slowly, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the monitors less like tools and more like witnesses to something he did not understand. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare break in composure that no one else would ever see, because for the first time since the accident, he was facing something he could not control, not through money, not through influence, not through force. He stood abruptly, the decision forming before he could question it. He needed more than footage, more than observation. He needed to see it happen in real time, without filters, without distance. He shut down the playback and left the control room, his steps deliberate, his focus sharpened into something new, not suspicion anymore, but intent. As he moved through the quiet hallways of the mansion, the weight of the moment followed him. Not heavy, but persistent, like a truth waiting just out of reach. And somewhere ahead of him, Ava Johnson continued her routine, unaware that the man who had built his world on watching was about to step out from behind the screens and confront something he could no longer observe from a distance. Dominic Russo did not slow down as he moved through the mansion, his steps quiet but purposeful, the kind of movement that came from years of knowing exactly where he was going even when the outcome was uncertain. But tonight was different, because for the first time he was not moving toward control, he was moving toward something he did not understand. The hallway lights dimmed automatically as he passed, casting long shadows along the walls. And when he reached Ethan's door, he did not hesitate. This time, he opened it without announcement, without warning, stepping into the room as if he needed to interrupt something before it could disappear. Ava Johnson was already there, standing beside the bed, just as she had been in the footage, her hand resting lightly over Ethan's chest, her head slightly bowed, and for a brief second she did not notice him, which allowed Dominic to see the moment exactly as it was, not through a screen, not filtered by distance, but real, immediate, unguarded. The room was quiet, no machines beeping, no voices, just the soft rhythm of Ethan's breathing and Ava's presence beside him. Dominic stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked on her hand, watching, waiting, measuring. Ava slowly lifted her head then, sensing something shift in the room, and when she turned and saw him standing there, her expression did not change dramatically. No shock, no panic, just awareness. "Sir," she said softly, her voice calm even now. Dominic did not respond immediately. He raised one hand slightly, not to stop her, but to hold the moment in place. "Do not move," he said quietly, his tone controlled but focused in a way that carried more weight than anger ever could. Ava froze, not out of fear, but because she understood he was not accusing her this time. He was observing. Dominic stepped closer, his attention fixed entirely on Ethan now. "Keep your hand where it is," he added, and there was something new in his voice, something that had not been there before, not command, not suspicion, but intent. Ava obeyed without hesitation, her hand remaining exactly where it had been. Light, steady, almost weightless against Ethan's chest. Dominic watched, seconds passing in silence, his mind tracking every detail, the rise and fall of Ethan's breathing, the stillness of his face, the subtle tension in Ava's posture, and then it happened, small, almost invisible, but undeniable. Ethan's breathing shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone who was not looking to notice, but Dominic was looking, fully present, fully aware, and he saw it. The rhythm changed, a slight variation, a response. Dominic's breath caught for just a fraction of a second, his composure holding but strained now by something he could not dismiss. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as if proximity could confirm what logic resisted. "Again," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off his son. Ava did not ask what he meant. She simply adjusted her hand slightly, not pressing, not forcing, just shifting the contact. And once again the change came, subtle but consistent. Ethan's breathing responded. Dominic straightened slowly, the weight of the moment settling into him with a clarity that no footage had been able to provide. This was not coincidence, not imagination, not a trick of observation. This was real, and for the first time since the accident, something inside his son had reacted to something outside of him. Dominic turned his head slightly toward Ava, his expression unreadable but no longer dismissive. "What are you doing?" he asked again, but this time the question was different, not an accusation, not a challenge, but a demand for understanding. Ava met his gaze, steady as before, but now there was something else in her eyes, not defiance, not fear, but recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "I am not doing anything to him," she said softly, repeating her earlier words. "I am reminding him that he is still here," and the room fell into a Silence that felt heavier than anything Dominic had ever controlled, because this time he had seen it for himself, and there was no screen left between him and the truth. Dominic Russo did not speak again right away, because for the first time in a long time, he did not trust his own voice to remain steady. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, but emotionally, as if something invisible had shifted the weight of everything inside it. Ava Johnson stood where she was, her hand still resting lightly against Ethan's chest, her posture calm but grounded, as if she understood that this moment mattered more than any explanation she could offer. Dominic turned his attention back to his son, his eyes scanning every detail with a focus that had nothing to do with control anymore and everything to do with recognition. Ethan's face remained still, his eyes open, fixed somewhere beyond the visible. But now Dominic saw something he had not allowed himself to see before, not movement, not expression, but presence, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. "Ethan," he said again, softer this time, not as a command, not as a test, but as a father trying to reach something. He had almost stopped believing was still there. Ava did not interrupt, she did not guide. She simply remained, her hand steady, her breathing calm, and then Dominic noticed it again. That slight change, the rhythm of Ethan's breathing shifting just enough to break the pattern that had defined the past year. It was not dramatic, it was not something that would make headlines or impress specialists, but it was real. And that was enough to change everything. Dominic straightened slowly his mind, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he had been told, everything he had accepted. "How long?" he asked quietly, his eyes still on Ethan. Ava understood the question without needing clarification. "Since the second day I started working here," she answered, her voice steady but gentle. Dominic's gaze shifted to her immediately, surprise breaking through his composure for the first time. "And you did not think to tell me?" he asked, not angrily, but with something deeper, something closer to disbelief. Ava held his gaze, not defensive, not apologetic, just honest. "You were watching him," she said simply, and the words landed with more weight than any accusation. Dominic froze, the truth in her statement cutting through everything else. He had been watching every second, every detail, every breath, but he had been watching through screens, through systems, through control, not through presence, not through connection. Ava lowered her gaze slightly before continuing. "He does not respond to being watched," she said quietly. "He responds to being felt." Dominic exhaled slowly, the words settling into something he could not dismiss, something that did not fit into logic, but could not be ignored either. He looked back at Ethan, studying him again, not as a patient, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who might still be reaching back in ways he had never understood. "Show me," Dominic said after a moment, his voice calm but certain. Ava nodded once. Acknowledging the request, she adjusted her position slightly, her hand still resting against Ethan's chest. And then she did something Dominic had not noticed before. She closed her eyes, just for a second, as if grounding herself, as if connecting to something beyond the physical. And when she opened them again, her focus was entirely on Ethan, not the room, not Dominic, just him. "You are still here," she whispered softly, her voice barely above a breath, and Dominic felt something shift again, not in the room, but inside himself, because those words were not instructions, they were not treatment, they were recognition. And once again, Ethan's breathing changed, subtle but consistent. Dominic's chest tightened, his mind no longer searching for explanations, but beginning to accept something far more difficult, that everything he had built around control had kept him close to his son, but not connected to him. And now this woman, this quiet presence he had almost dismissed, was showing him something he had never been able to see, something that could not be recorded, could not be measured, could not be controlled. And for the first time, Dominic Russo realized that the cameras had never been protecting his son. They had been keeping him at a distance. Dominic Russo did not realize how long he had been standing there until the light in the room began to shift. The soft glow from the window, fading into the deeper tones of evening. But he had not moved because something inside him refused to let the moment pass too quickly. Ava Johnson remained beside Ethan, her presence quiet but steady, No longer something he questioned, but something he was beginning to observe with a different kind of attention. Not suspicion, not control, but awareness, and that change unsettled him more than anything else because it meant letting go of the one thing he had relied on for so long. He stepped back slowly, creating a small distance between himself and the bed, not out of rejection, but out of thought. His mind working through everything he had seen, everything he had believed, everything. That no longer felt as certain as it once had. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked again. But this time the question was softer, less about accusation and more about understanding. Ava did not answer immediately, her hand still resting lightly against Ethan's chest, her gaze focused on the boy as if the answer was already there between them. "Because you would have tried to measure it," she said finally, her voice calm, steady. And those words landed with a quiet precision that Dominic could not deny. He exhaled slowly, recognizing the truth in them even if he did not want to admit it. Everything in his world had always been measured, controlled, verified, but this, whatever this was, did not fit into those systems. "And now," he said, his voice low, almost reflective. Ava shifted her gaze to him then, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "Now you saw it," she replied simply. And that was the difference. Not explanation, not persuasion, just experience. Dominic nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something that could not be undone. He turned his attention back to Ethan, studying him again, but this time with a different kind of focus, not searching for problems, not analyzing patterns, but looking for connection, something he had not truly done in a long time. He moved closer to the bed again, his hand hovering slightly above Ethan's shoulder before he hesitated, the motion unfamiliar now, uncertain. Ava noticed the hesitation, but did not speak. She simply watched, giving him the space to find it on his own. Dominic took a quiet breath and then placed his hand gently on his son's shoulder, not adjusting, not correcting, just there, present. The contact was simple, almost ordinary, but it carried something new, something he had not allowed himself to feel before. He waited, not expecting anything, not demanding a response, just staying in the moment. And then, slowly, something changed. Ethan's breathing shifted again, subtle but consistent, the same variation Dominic had seen before, but this time it was different because it was him, not Ava. Dominic's fingers tightened slightly, not out of fear but out of realization, his eyes fixed on his son as the pattern broke again, not once but twice. And in that moment something inside Dominic Russo cracked. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to let something through, something he had been holding back for far too long. He swallowed hard, his voice quieter than it had ever been. "I am here," he said softly, the words unfamiliar but necessary. Ava watched in silence, her expression calm but knowing, as if she had been waiting for this moment from the very beginning. And as the room settled into a new kind of stillness, one that was not empty but full of something unspoken, Dominic understood something he had never learned in all his years of power and control, that presence could not be forced, that connection could not be watched into existence, and that sometimes the most important things were not the ones you could see on screen, but the ones you could finally feel when you stopped trying to control them. The room remained quiet long after Dominic Russo spoke those words, but it was no longer the same kind of silence that had filled it for the past year. This one felt different, alive in a way that could not be explained but could not be ignored either. Dominic did not remove his hand from Ethan's shoulder. Not immediately, because for the first time the stillness did not feel like absence. It felt like waiting, like something just beneath the surface was beginning to respond. Ava Johnson stepped back slightly then, not leaving the room, but creating space, her role shifting without needing to be spoken. She was no longer guiding the moment. She was witnessing it, and Dominic understood that instinctively. His focus remained on his son, his posture no longer rigid with control, but grounded in something quieter, something more present. The seconds stretched but did not feel heavy, they felt necessary. And then Ethan's breathing shifted again, subtle, consistent, and unmistakably connected to the moment. Dominic felt it this time, not just as observation, but as confirmation. His hand remained steady, his voice softer than ever. "You hear me, do not you?" he said, not expecting an answer in words, but no longer dismissing the possibility of something else, something deeper. Ava watched him carefully, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if this was the moment she had been working toward since the day she arrived. Dominic finally lifted his hand slowly, not pulling away completely but easing back, his eyes still fixed on Ethan, memorizing the change, anchoring it in something real. "This is not coincidence," he said quietly, more to himself than to Ava. But she heard it, and she nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not need explanation. Dominic turned toward her then, his expression no longer guarded in the same way. There was still authority there, still control, but now it was tempered by something new, something that allowed space for what he did not yet understand. "You said you understand what it feels like to be trapped," he said, his voice calm but searching. Ava held his gaze for a moment, and for the first time there was a flicker of something deeper in her expression, something that had been held back until now. "Yes," she answered quietly. Dominic studied her, noticing the weight behind that single word, the kind of weight that did not come from theory or training, but from experience. "Then explain it to me," he said, not as a command, but as a request. Ava hesitated, not because she was unwilling, but because what she was about to say carried something personal, something she did not offer lightly. She glanced briefly at Ethan before speaking, as if grounding herself in the reason she had come this far. "When someone is trapped like that," she began softly, "they do not need to be fixed first, they need to be found." Dominic's brow tightened slightly, not in disagreement, but in concentration. "Found," he repeated, the word unfamiliar in this context. Ava nodded gently. "You have been protecting him," she said, her voice steady. "But protection is not the same as connection." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. Dominic did not respond right away, because he could not deny what he had just seen, what he had just felt, and for the first time he understood that everything he had built around his son had kept him safe, but not necessarily reached him. He turned back to Ethan slowly, his gaze softer now, more open, as if he were seeing his son not as someone lost, but as someone still there, waiting. And in that moment, Dominic Russo realized something that no camera could have shown him, that the distance between him and his son had never been physical. It had been something else entirely, something he was only now beginning to close, one quiet moment at a time. Dominic Russo remained standing beside the bed long after Ava's words settled into the room. Not because he did not understand them, but because he understood them too well, and that kind of realization did not move quickly. It rooted itself, it spread, it changed the ground beneath everything he thought he knew. He looked at Ethan again, not searching for signs anymore, not analyzing patterns, but simply seeing him, really seeing him, the quiet rise and fall of his chest, the stillness that no longer felt empty, the presence that had been there all along, just waiting to be acknowledged. Dominic exhaled slowly, a breath that carried something heavier than control, something closer to release. And then he turned toward Ava Johnson again, his expression different now, not softened in a way that made him weak, but steadied in a way that made him honest. "You said you felt this before," he said, his voice low but clear. Ava did not look away. She held his gaze for a moment. "And this time there was no hesitation in her answer. "My younger brother," she said quietly. And just those 3 words shifted the air in the room. Dominic did not interrupt. He did not question. He simply listened, something he had not done enough of in a long time. Ava's eyes moved briefly toward Ethan before returning to Dominic. "He was in an accident when he was 16, she continued, her voice steady, but carrying something deeper beneath it. Not pain in a way that overwhelmed, but memory in a way that never left. He could not move, could not speak. The doctor said there was very little we could do." Dominic felt the familiar shape of those words, the same language he had heard from specialists, from reports, from carefully measured expectations. But hearing them now from her carried a different weight. "And you helped him," Dominic said, not as a question, but as a realization. Ava's expression shifted slightly, not into sadness, but into something more complex, something that held both truth and consequence. "I tried," she said, and the simplicity of that answer said more than anything else could have. Dominic watched her closely, sensing there was more. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Ava took a small breath, her gaze lowering for just a moment before she spoke again. "We could not afford the care he needed," she said, her Voice still calm, but now edged with something that did not need to be named. I worked 2 jobs, then 3, but it was never enough. Dominic felt something tighten in his chest, not out of sympathy alone, but out of recognition of a reality he had never had to face. Ava continued, her tone steady but grounded in something real. He started responding when I was with him. Small things, changes in breathing, the way his eyes would focus. But I kept waiting for something bigger, something I could prove, something that would make people take it seriously. She paused just briefly, and that pause carried more weight than any detail. I waited too long. She finished quietly. Dominic did not speak, because he understood what she was saying without her needing to explain it further. The room held that silence again, but now was filled with something shared, something understood. Ava lifted her gaze again, meeting his eyes directly. I'm not trying to fix your son, she said. Softly, I am not trying to prove anything. Dominic nodded slowly, the words settling into something he could not argue with. Then what are you trying to do? He asked, and this time there was no resistance in the question, only openness. Ava glanced at Ethan once more, her expression steady, grounded, certain. I am making sure he is not alone in there, she said, and those words did not just fill the room. They changed it, because Dominic realized in that moment that everything he had done had been about protecting his son from the outside world, but Ava had been reaching him from within, and for the first time Dominic Russo understood that presence, not power, was what his son had needed all along. Dominic Russo stood in that room longer than he had intended, not because he did not know what to do next, but because for the first time in a long time he was not rushing toward a solution. He was standing inside a realization, and that realization was changing something fundamental in him. He looked at Ava Johnson again, not as an employee, not as someone beneath his authority, but as someone who had brought something into his house that money, power, and control had never been able to provide. And that recognition carried weight, not the kind that could be spoken easily, but the kind that shifted how a man saw the world. Dominic exhaled slowly and then turned his attention back to Ethan, stepping closer again, this time without hesitation, without calculation, just presence. He placed his hand gently over his son's shoulder once more, not testing, not measuring, just there, and again the subtle change came, the slight shift in breathing that no longer felt like coincidence. Dominic closed his eyes for just a second, not out of weakness, but out of acknowledgement, because this was real. And when he opened them again, there was no resistance left in his expression, only clarity. He turned toward Ava, his voice steady but different now, stripped of the edge it had carried before. You are not just a maid, he said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Ava did not react dramatically. She did not step forward or explain herself. She simply met his gaze, calm as always. No, she said, and there was no arrogance in it, only truth. Dominic nodded once, absorbing that. You should have told me, he added, but this time the words carried no accusation, only the recognition of something that had been missed. Ava's expression softened slightly, just enough to show that she understood what he meant. You would not have believed me, she replied, and Dominic did not argue because he knew she was right, completely right. He had built his world on evidence, on proof, on control, and what she was offering did not fit into any of those categories until he had seen it for himself. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was reflective, and in that silence Dominic made a decision. Not one based on strategy or calculation, but one based on something far more unfamiliar, trust. He stepped back slightly, his posture still strong, still authoritative, but now carrying something else, something quieter. From now on, he said, his voice calm but final. We do not need permission to be in this room. Ava's eyes shifted just slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement of what that meant. Dominic continued, and the cameras, he paused for a moment, glancing briefly toward the corner where the small lens had been watching everything. They come down. The words landed with quiet certainty, not dramatic, not forceful, but absolute. Ava did not respond immediately. And for a moment the room held that decision in silence, because it was more than just removing surveillance. It was removing distance, removing control, removing the barrier that had kept Dominic present but not connected. He turned back to Ethan again, his gaze steady, his presence grounded. "We do this your way," he said softly, not to Ava, but to his son, and that shift, that simple acknowledgement, carried more meaning than anything else he had said. Ava lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in respect for the moment. And as the light in the room softened into evening and the silence settled into something warm instead of empty, Dominic Russo stood there not as a man who controlled everything, but as a father who had finally learned how to be present. And in that quiet transformation, something far more powerful than control had taken its place. The next morning did not feel like any other morning in Dominic Russo's house because something invisible had shifted overnight, not in the structure of the mansion, not in the routines of the staff, but in the space between people, in the silence that used to feel controlled and now felt open. And Dominic noticed at the moment he stepped into Ethan's room without checking a single screen first, without reviewing a single piece of footage. He entered as a man who no longer needed confirmation. From a monitor to be present, the curtains were partially open, letting in a soft, natural light that filled the room with a warmth that had always been there, but had never truly been noticed. Ethan lay as he always had, still quiet, but no longer distant in Dominic's eyes. And Ava Johnson was already there, standing near the window this time. Not at the bedside, not intervening, just allowing the moment to belong to Dominic. She turned slightly when he entered, offering a small nod of acknowledgement, but no words, because none were needed anymore. Dominic moved toward his son with a calm steadiness that felt unfamiliar but right. He sat down beside the bed, not standing over it, not observing from above, but lowering himself to the same level, his hand resting gently over Ethan's arm. The contact simple, grounded, and without expectation. "Good morning, Ethan," he said softly, his voice no longer carrying command, only presence. The room remained quiet, but the silence did not feel empty. It felt like something listening. Ava watched from a distance, her posture relaxed but attentive, and for the first time she did not guide. She did not demonstrate. She simply allowed Dominic to find his own way into the connection she had been building. Seconds passed, then a minute, and Dominic did not rush. He did not look for signs. He did not measure the moment. He simply stayed. And then it happened again, subtle but real. Ethan's breathing shifted, not in response to instruction, not in reaction to pressure, but in recognition. Dominic felt it through his hand, not just saw it. And that difference changed everything. His fingers tightened slightly, not out of control, but out of awareness, his voice dropping even softer. "I am right here," he said, and this time the words carried something deeper, something anchored, and Ava's eyes lowered briefly, not an emotion that overwhelmed, but in quiet acknowledgement of what she was witnessing. Dominic remained there, not moving, not breaking the moment, and as the minutes stretched, the connection did not fade. It held, steady, fragile, but real. And for the first time since the accident, Dominic Russo did not feel like he was waiting for his son to return. He felt like he was already there with him, sharing something that could not be explained, could not be proven, but could be felt. He glanced briefly toward Ava then, not questioning, not doubting, but understanding. And in that glance there was something new, something earned, trust. Ava met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say this was always possible. It had just needed to be seen differently. Dominic turned back to Ethan, his hand still resting where it had been, his presence unwavering, and the room settled into a quiet rhythm that no longer needed cameras, no longer needed control, only presence. And as the morning light grew stronger and filled every corner of the space, it revealed something that had been hidden not by darkness, but by distance. That connection does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly and stays only when it is truly felt. By the time evening returned to Dominic Russo's house, nothing looked different on the surface. The same lights lined the hallways. The same staff moved quietly through their routines. The same rooms held the same silence. But beneath all of it, something had changed in a way that could not be reversed. And Dominic felt it in every step he took, not as a loss of control, but as the absence of something he no longer needed. He walked past the control room without stopping, without even glancing. Inside, the monitors still glowing behind the closed door, still recording, still watching, but no longer holding the same importance they once had. And when he entered Ethan's room again, he did so without hesitation, without calculation, just presence. Ava Johnson was there as she had been throughout the day, not standing over Ethan, not directing anything, just existing within the space in a way that made it feel different, warmer, more human. She looked up as Dominic entered, her expression calm, steady, and there was no need for words between them now, because something had already been understood. Dominic moved to Ethan's side, sitting down again with a familiarity that had not existed before, his hand resting gently over his son's arm. Not searching, not testing, just there. "I am here," he said quietly, the same words as before, but now they carried weight, not as a statement, but as a promise. The room settled into that quiet again, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with something that could not be seen but could be felt. And then it happened, not dramatically, not in a way that would change everything in an instant, but in a way that mattered. Ethan's fingers moved just slightly, a small shift that could have been missed by anyone who was not present, but Dominic saw it. He felt it, and for a moment he did not breathe, his hand tightening just enough to confirm that it was real, not imagined. Not hoped for, but real. Ava saw it too, but she did not react. Outwardly, she did not rush forward or speak. She simply remained still, allowing the moment to belong to Dominic and his son. Dominic's eyes stayed fixed on Ethan's hand, his voice softer than ever, almost a whisper. "That is it," he said, not commanding, not expecting more, just acknowledging what had already happened. And in that acknowledgement, there was something powerful, something grounding, something that did not push for more, but honored what was. The room fell into a deeper silence. Then, not heavy, not tense, but full, as if everything that needed to be said had already been understood. Dominic slowly looked up, his gaze meeting Ava's across the room. And in that look there was no hierarchy, no distance, just recognition. She had not fixed his son. She had not changed anything in the way the world would measure it. But she had given him something he had lost without realizing it. The ability to truly be there. To connect without control, to see without watching. Dominic stood slowly, his movements calm, deliberate, and after a brief pause he walked to the corner of the room where the small camera had been mounted. He reached up and without ceremony, without hesitation, he turned it off, the small red light fading into nothing. The room no longer observed, no longer recorded, just lived in. He stepped back, looking at the space as if seeing it for the first time. Not as a place to protect, but as a place to be present. Ava lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in quiet acknowledgement of what that act meant. And Dominic returned to Ethan's side, sitting down once more, his hand finding his son's again, steady, grounded, real. And in that quiet moment, without announcement, without spectacle, something far more powerful than control settled into the room. And that day, the man who had once watched everything finally learned what it meant to truly see.